I went to Ludhiana. I used to carry a little diary, a little black diary like many of us do, like a jot pad, and I used to write observations of what I saw in the marketplace. This is a very industrial engineer kind of activity, which a salesman in Punjab is certainly not used to. At the end of the morning session, at about 12:31, we broke for lunch, and I whipped out my diary and said, "Can I give you some feedback?" I was doing my job very seriously. Technically, I was absolutely spot on. I was the senior, he was the junior, I was giving him feedback. And I said that, Narendra, you have spent about 52.6% of your time. I used to carry a slide rule. When I think of it, it's so silly, but I actually did it. I actually carried a slide rule, calculated the second decimal place, and told him he had spent 52.67% of time on greeting the customer and hardly 20% on product presentation, and hardly another 15% on closing the deal, and the last bit on exit. And he said, "Yeah, but I've been doing that for 30 years, so what's wrong with it?" I said, "No, you should spend much more time on product presentation, closing the deal, etc." He said, "Okay, if you say so, but I'm very intrigued that you carry this jot pad and this white thing in your pocket. Why don't you do it and show me?" And I said, "Oh my God, here I am. Nemesis has stopped me." And I had a choice. I could say, "You're acting arrogant." Remember, we had union difficulties in those days, and I could tick him off on the ground that he was challenging authority. I was very tempted to do that, but I somehow felt that wasn't the right thing to do. The second was to make a half-hearted attempt and then give up after 2 calls. Third was to do the lot. And even if I was incompetent, I would show that I would do it. I would perform my incompetence with great competence, to put it in a nutshell. And that's what I did. It was hot as hell. I was sweating. And we used to carry some little cloth in our hand to clean the tins and dust the packets and all that stuff. At 6:30, I had made a complete hash of the afternoon. I had made calls which finished in about 4.5, 5 minutes, because there was no inquiry with the customer. I just did the technical parts of the job and came away. And I reckon I looked rather stupid, and he looked rather triumphant in my eyes. And then he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I think you'll advance in this company." So I was quite taken aback. What could he mean by that? Is he being sarcastic? He said, "जिन्होंने अपने हाथ से मेहनत नहीं किया है और अपने जो साथी हैं उनका काम नहीं किया है, वो आगे नहीं बढ़ सकता है। आपने कोशिश किया है, सफल नहीं हुए वो अलग बात है, आप आगे बढ़ेंगे। ये याद रखना लेकिन, that you must always be able to do the work of your subordinate and show that you can do the work, otherwise you can't advance." When I got into the train at Jalandhar on my way back to Delhi, I reflected just for a few seconds. I think I reflected a lot more after the event, much after the event, and said, wasn't there a pearl of wisdom in that 3-minute interaction where the guy is telling me that you might be called branch sales manager, which is quite a high-level position in the sales hierarchy, at the age of 28, and I am 56. But please remember, you always be ready to do the job of your subordinate. And I adopted what a general in the US Army once said, that a general who will not perform the duties of his soldier can never lead his soldier. And I think it's a very cute little lesson. When you're running a business, they often say you must have a much larger purpose. And if you want to be a true leader, you must give people a larger purpose. And I often reflect, how do you give people a larger purpose? What is large to him or her? And I narrate a story which happened in 1974 when I went to work as the marketing manager of a permanently quote-unquote loss-making dairy in a place called Eta in UP. And my boss was Bipin Shah, who was called the controller of foods at that time. And both of us were at a loss to know what to do, because for 10 years before we got involved, various very well-known, successful leaders had taken charge of the business, but it continued to make losses. And the attempts of Hindustan Unilever to sell the dairy were not successful. Then we had various actions, which I don't have to go into in this video, But then we had a conference of the salesmen. And my boss, Bipin Shah, and I sat down and said, how can you give them a larger purpose other than targets and the usual things? And then he got up almost spontaneously. This was not with any plan. After saying whatever the slides required him to say, he looked pensively at the audience and said, you know, the livelihoods of 170 people in this factory is at stake. And each of them has a family which has about 5 people. And therefore, 850 people will benefit if we can save this factory. If we continue to make losses, we can't save this factory. Can you think of these 850 people? Some of them are children, some of them are women. And see if you could just sell one more tin, one more packet of milk powder, it might help. And it was a very poignant moment because people suddenly felt very touched by the human part of the factory. Luckily for us, in the next 2 years, for the first time in its history, the factory broke even and then started to make a little bit of money. But that's not the point I want to make. The point I want to make is during the cocktails and the dinner after that, people came and said what really moved me was that whatever I'm doing might actually help 850 people for their livelihood. And I thought that's a cute little story.